But tonight we are continuing in our series So Much More. This is part 2. We kicked this off just last Wednesday. It's a 3-part series. And if you were here last week, what we told you is that this whole series, the 3 weeks, we're kind of going to be continuing to come back to this one question. And that's this. What does it mean to be a Christian? And kind of what we said last week was, when I asked this question, I'm not saying like, theologically, what are you supposed to believe? Or how do you first place your faith in Jesus? How do you pray that prayer? Those are awesome, important questions. If you have those questions, we'd love to talk to you about them. And we will very likely teach about that in the upcoming future. We talk about it a lot. But that's not what I'm saying when I ask this question in this series. When I'm saying, what does it mean to be a Christian? I mean, for Christians, which many of you in the room are Christians. When you are a Christian, what does that mean? What do Christians do? What are we supposed to be doing with our faith? Last week we said that many people might boil our faith down to be good, go to church, and hope that you make it to heaven. And while those aren't bad things, kind of the idea behind this series and the title of the series is that there is so much more to following Jesus than that. There is so much more than just being a good boy or a good girl and showing up to church semi-frequently and hoping if you do all that, you get to make it to heaven. There's so much more than that. Last week, we kicked off the series with a message entitled, Here on Earth, and the idea behind that is that our whole faith is not about getting to heaven. Obviously, we hope that we are going to go to heaven. That's our hope and our reward, but that's not what it's all about. In fact, when Jesus taught his disciples how to pray, he said you should pray something like, God, your kingdom come, your will be done here on earth, like it already is in heaven where you are. And we learned last week that Jesus needs us in the world, not checking out, not tuning out, but he needs us as Christians here in the world. Why? To redeem the world, to pay attention to the people and the things around us so we can make our world a better place. We can redeem the world around us. Now, if that's true, which I believe it is, if we're not supposed to disengage from the world, if in fact we're supposed to lean in and make a difference, well, that brings a different question. You might ask this question, like, where do I begin? Maybe you've wondered, like, where do I even start with this? Maybe you're new to faith and you're like, okay, so like I took this big step to say I believe that Jesus is who he says he is and he died for me and all that. Like, now what do I do now? Like, where do I begin? Or maybe you grew up in church like I did and you've been a Christian for a while, but maybe as you're coming to this age in your life and this stage in your life, your faith is starting to become more real to you and you're like, where do I start with this? What am I supposed to do with this? Now, I don't know about you, but it can get a little bit overwhelming when we look around with all that's wrong in our world. I don't know how much news a high schooler watches. Probably, hopefully less than your parents, but you probably still know things that are happening in the world. I think that this generation gets most of their news from TikTok, and I'm not sure how I feel about that, but you're semi-informed, right? So you're at least somewhat aware that there's some wars out there, right? There's a war in Ukraine, there's a war in Israel. There's natural disasters all the time. There's earthquakes and mudslides and fires, and there's suffering like everywhere you turn. It seems like it's just overwhelming how much suffering there is. And even if it's not about like the national and global news, I'm sure that you all have stories closer to home that don't make the headlines, but they're important to you, of people in your own life, or maybe it's you, that you have your own suffering that you're dealing with, your own issues, your own stress, your own pressure, and it can feel very overwhelming. Now here is how it can make me feel sometimes, and maybe you can relate. I've felt this way sometimes, where I feel like I can't help everyone. Like I look around and there's just so many people who need help. There's so many hungry people and so many impoverished people and so many hurting and lost people. And so I feel like I can't help everyone. And so because of that, we help no one, right? Like I can't help everyone, so I'm just going to help no one. Like we kind of can have that attitude. Like, I can't do it all, so I'm just not gonna do any of it. Or maybe you think this way, like I can't change everything. There's just so much out there to fix and change, and so much wrong with our world. And what I love about your generation is you are noticing the things broken in our world, and you're doing something about it. You're not afraid to speak up when something's wrong or unjust, and I love that. But sometimes when you notice how much is wrong, you can think, I can't change everything, and so we change nothing. We can get so overwhelmed by how many people there are to help and how many things there are to change that we can end up just saying, you know what, I'm just not going to help anyone or change anything or do anything because there's just too much. And what I want to tell you tonight is that that's actually a trap of a way to think. It's a trap that's not unique to you. If you've ever felt that way, you're not the only one who's ever felt that way. And here's the really good news. Jesus actually addressed this way of thinking clearly in Scripture. In Luke chapter 10, we see a really cool exchange between Jesus and a legal expert. Now, when it says an expert in the law, it's not talking about like a lawyer like Morgan & Morgan for the people. It's a different kind of law. It's talking about religious law. This is a religious elite expert, okay? And there's a really cool interaction between Jesus and this man that leads to a really cool story. So let's read it together. Luke 10, beginning in verse 25. It says, one day an expert in religious law stood up to test Jesus by asking him this question. Teacher, what should I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus replied, what does the law of Moses say? How do you read it? The man answered, you must love the Lord your God with all your heart, all your soul, all your strength, and all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And then Jesus replies, look at this reply. He goes, right. How would you feel if you got quizzed by Jesus and you answered? He's like, right answer. I'd be like, okay, I'm good. I'm just going to quit for the day. Right. He was like, right on. You got the right answer. Right. Do this and you will live. But the man didn't stop there. Verse 29, it says, the man wanted to justify his actions, so he asked Jesus, why don't you read this with me, and who is my neighbor? So we actually talked about this recently. If you're here, we talked about this greatest commandment, right? In the series GOAT, the greatest commandment that Jesus said, you love God with all of you and you love your neighbor as yourself. This is really important stuff. This matters to God. And this man knew that. He had the right answer. And Jesus is like, right on, do that. But then this man did what we often sometimes do. He's like, hey, Jesus, while we're on the topic of love your neighbor, who's my neighbor? Who is my neighbor? And the question could have come from a couple different perspectives. It could have been a question of where do I start? Who's my neighbor? Who am I supposed to be loving right now? Where do I begin? What does this neighbor thing mean? But more likely what it meant, because it said he's trying to justify himself, more likely what it meant is he was probably asking, how far does this really go? How many neighbors do I have? How far does this neighbor idea go? Is it literally the people right next to me? Because I can count them. That's cool. But who's my neighbor? Essentially, he was trying to ask, where are the loopholes? Where are the ways out? Where does this stop? When do I get to stop loving people? When do I get to stop giving to people? How far does this go? Who is my neighbor? Really, when the rubber meets the road, what am I actually doing with this whole love your neighbor thing? Now, in response, Jesus tells a story. How many of you guys like stories? Anybody like stories? I like stories. Most people like stories. So I want to thank you for the late reply. That's good. I want to invite you to lean into a really good story. We're going to read a lot of verses, but it is a really good story that Jesus told to illustrate this point and answer this question of who is my neighbor. And many of you, because you grew up in church, you've probably heard this story, but I still want you to lean in and pay attention because we can learn something new. So beginning in verse 30, look at this. Jesus replied with a story. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along. So a priest, a really important religious person, like a pastor, really important religious person. He came along, but when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road. You would think the priest would be I'm not going to do the right thing. But the priest sees him. He crossed to the other side of the road and he passed him by. Then verse 32, a temple assistant walked over. This would be not a pastor, but a church staff person, maybe a worship leader or a church secretary. Still, somebody who should probably do the right thing, right? A temple assistant walked over and looked at him. He actually came close and checked it out, scoped out the situation. He looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Then, Jesus says, then a despised Samaritan came along. Here's something you might not know. In the time of Jesus, there was a group of people living in a land nearby Israel called Samaria, and the people who lived there were Samaritans. And for a bunch of different reasons that we won't get into tonight, the Jews and the Samaritans did not get along. They did not like each other. In fact, beyond just not getting along and not liking each other, the Jews considered all of the Samaritans to be unclean, ceremonially unclean, meaning you can't be friends with a Samaritan, you can't touch a Samaritan, you shouldn't talk to a Samaritan, because if you do, you will also be unclean. It sounds ridiculous, it sounds racist, kind of was, but it was the reality of the time of Jesus. And so when Jesus decides to include a Samaritan in his story, everybody listening was like, where are you going with this? Where are you going with this story, Jesus? And so he brings a Samaritan into the story. He already said a priest didn't do the right thing. A temple worker didn't do the right thing. But verse 33, then a despised Samaritan came along. And when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, take care of this man, and if his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here. And then Jesus ends his story, and in verse 36, he turns his attention back to this man and asks him this question. Now, which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits? Verse 37, the man replied, the one who showed him mercy. And Jesus said, yes, now go and do the same. Jesus didn't just include a Samaritan in his story. He took the insane position of making the Samaritan the hero. He made the priest and the temple assistant out to be villains, and he made the Samaritan a hero. And then he said, hey, everybody, go be like that Samaritan. Telling you, everybody was probably like, whoa, okay, Jesus, you're a little bit pushing the envelope here. But Jesus is teaching us a powerful yet simple reality. He's saying to this religious expert, to everybody else listening, to all of us reading this, that if you really want to know who your neighbor is whatever person in need is around you. It is the person around you, close to you, who is in most need. That is your neighbor, and you are a neighbor when you notice and do something about it. You are a neighbor to people when you notice they're hurting and you do something about it. And I want you to think, did this Samaritan, this is often called the story of the Good Samaritan, did this Samaritan change the entire world with what they did? Like if there would have been a news broadcast that night in Israel, Judea, and Samaria, would they have said, this breaking news, world hunger solved because a random Samaritan helped one Jewish man who got robbed? Would that have been the headline? No. That Samaritan did not change the entire world. But do you think that if you had a chance to interview that Jewish man who was robbed, do you think he would have said that the Samaritan changed his world? Absolutely. And here's what I want you to begin to think. Oftentimes, like I said, we get so overwhelmed. I can't help everybody. I can't fix everything. I can't do everything. And so we just get overwhelmed by that, and we miss the little things that we can do. We miss the small things that actually make a really big difference. Maybe not for the whole world, but for someone's world. And you know what? It may cost you something to help other people. This Samaritan stopped, was interrupted, took up his entire day, gave that guy the ride on the donkey, and he walked, took him to a hotel, paid the bill, said, I'll pay you even more if I have to. It did cost him something. And you know what? Sometimes when you step into someone's life who is hurting and in need, it may cost you something. It may cost you time. It may cost you your reputation when your friends are like, why were you talking to that kid? It may cost you something. But I can promise you it is 100% worth it, because you will change the world. Maybe not the whole world, but you will change that person's world. But in the end, I think what this message from Jesus teaches us is it really doesn't take a lot. It wasn't like this guy emptied his savings account and paid off this guy's house. It was just him noticing, being present, paying attention, doing something, leaning into the opportunities that are all around us that other people pass by. And sometimes we can be tempted to say, well, they passed it by, so maybe I'll pass it by. But after the priest and the temple assistant passed it by, the Samaritan said, no, I have to do something. And here's the reality. There are countless stories just like this. that illustrate how a seemingly small gesture makes all the difference in the world to someone. I've heard personal stories of people who were at their lowest point in life. They felt worthless and unnoticed and hopeless, and were even at a point where they were thinking about taking their own life, but because just one person noticed them and smiled at them and talked to them, it changed everything for them. Something small made the world of difference to someone. There's a great quote from an author that lived in the early 1900s named Bruce Barton. You've probably never heard of him, but he said an amazing quote. He said this, he says, "Sometimes when I consider what tremendous consequences come from little things, I am tempted to think there are no little things." And here's how I want you to begin thinking as we're winding down and wrapping up. Sometimes I think we need to stop focusing on how big the problems of the world are. And maybe we need to pay attention to the small, simple things around us that we can do to make a big difference. That no, maybe you can't end world hunger. Maybe you can't cure cancer. Maybe you can't stop all of the pain. But maybe you can do something for someone somewhere. And rather than sitting back and saying, I can't help everybody, I can't do everything, there's too much. What if we looked around for the small, simple opportunities all around us every day that everybody else is walking past, and we decide to step into it and do something about it? Jesus didn't just teach about this topic in that story that he told. He also told another story that we're not going to read tonight, but I encourage you to read Matthew chapter 25. He tells this story. In fact, in this story, he kind of reveals that there's something that really matters a lot to God at the end of everything. Because what Jesus begins to say, he tells a story of a king dividing up his servants, but it was really a picture of the end times. And what he says here is that people are going to get divided into two groups, and it's based on some things that they either did or didn't do. And the things that they either did or didn't do might not be what you expect. It's not these big grandiose things of, oh, you did everything right. You were 100% perfect. You donated $1 million. You changed the whole world. You did this big grandiose thing. As Jesus begins talking about the things that matter enough to separate people into two groups where one group goes to heaven and one group doesn't, the things he begins to describe are things like this. He says, I was hungry and you fed me. I was thirsty and you gave me a drink. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you cared for me. I was in prison and you visited me. These are the things that Jesus said mattered. And when the people in this story began to wonder, Jesus, when did we do that for you? When did I feed you? When did I give you a drink? Here was his response in verse 40 of Matthew 25. The king will say, I tell you the truth, when you did it, when you gave food or drink or clothes to who? To one of the least of these, my brothers and sisters, you were doing it to me. Jesus said, it matters this much. It's not about the big grandiose things that you might think. It's not about these massive, impressive things. It's the little things done to the least of these that matter to God. Just paying attention, caring for people, and doing something. Refusing to be someone who just passes by. And noticing. And not allowing yourself to be overwhelmed with the magnitude of the world's problems. Yes, they're big and they're heartbreaking, and I'm not saying ignore them, but rather than being frozen by your inability to do everything, rather than being frozen by your inability to help everyone, maybe instead we do something and help someone somewhere. Maybe we pay attention to all of the opportunities all around us every day. And here's my final challenge to you as we get ready to close. I want to challenge you tonight to take it personal. I want you to take this message personal. I want you to apply it personally to your life. I don't want you walking out of here thinking, well, I really hope someone does something because of that. Well, I really hope someday somebody can help someone with something. I really hope one day I can help someone with something somewhere. I don't want you to make it vague and ambiguous. I want you to take it personal, and I want you to take personal responsibility for the change that you can make in the world. You can change the world. No, maybe you can't end world hunger, but you can share a meal with somebody in need. And many of you are at the age where you're beginning to make your own money, and you can buy somebody lunch. You can pay for the person behind you in the drive-thru. A little tip that I've learned is if you want to do that, you kind of roll your window down, you pull up not all the way, and you listen, and you see what they're ordering. And if they're ordering like food for the whole office, you're like, maybe I'll get the next person. But if they're like, I'll just have one number one, you're like, I got this. I can buy their number one, right? But you can do kind things. Maybe you can't end world hunger, but maybe you can feed one hungry person. Maybe you can't stop all the division and strife where it seems like everybody hates everybody everywhere right now. Maybe you can't end all of that, but maybe you can build a bridge between you and one person you disagree with. And instead of just writing them off because they think different than you, maybe you can have a conversation and change things. Maybe you can't eliminate depression and pain and anxiety, but you know what you can do? You can take the time to sit and listen to someone who's hurting and be in their corner and care for them. And maybe you can't change the whole world, but you absolutely can change someone's world. And I just want you to imagine with me for a second what the world might be like, what your school might be like if everybody who was a Christian just decided this week they were going to change someone's world. What would that do to our town? What would that do to our schools and our families and our neighborhoods if we stopped saying, I can't change the world, and we just said, you know what, my goal is this week, I'm just going to change someone's world. I'm going to make a difference for someone somewhere. I'm going to look for the little things. I'm going to find the opportunities that everybody else is walking by, and I'm going to walk in, and I'm going to do something about it. My challenge to you, take it personal. Decide that you will be here on earth in the world just like Jesus wants us to be, because there is so much more to our faith than just being good, getting by, and waiting for heaven. You were placed on this earth on purpose, for a purpose. God has a mission for your life, and you can make a difference if you just pay attention and look for opportunities to be the hands and feet of Jesus. Let's pray.